Hey guys, what's up? So just wanted to cover over a topic this morning that was asked about in our Instagram DM from someone in the militia, and it was in relation to repetition tempo. Now this is something we have written about in the past, but I appreciate that a lot of you won't have gotten through all of the articles that we have written, and I feel we can always add bits and bobs to those articles as well. You know, they're not always 100% complete in terms of like our learning evolves over time, and there may be things that we add to those, and we'll be updating them and kind of letting you guys know when we do that. But also when we make any new articles that may seem similar to old ones, recognize that it's probably because we might have a more updated spin on it. We may have read some new research that has changed our view, or whatever. So this video I'm just going to cover over some of the things that we may not have covered in the last tempo article, just because we wouldn't have introduced you guys to some of the biomechanics which you hopefully have read from the pectoralis major anatomy article series. So the second installment goes into some of the basics of things like resistance profiles and strength profiles and things like that, moment arms, torque, etc. But you don't really need to understand that, and again, the videos, the reason we're kind of recording some more videos is so that we can get information out to you guys in a kind of a applicable manner. So give you the take home points, make it no longer than 5 to 10 minutes hopefully. But anyway, so repetition tempo, what is it for those of you that may not have heard of it? It is like, if any of you are clients, you obviously know what it is. It's when we put together a program, we have a little section for tempo, and for example a tempo would be 3010. Okay, so the first number corresponds to the eccentric portion of an exercise. So if we refer to a bicep curl, it would be from the top down, so when that muscle is lengthening. So 3, 2, 1. And then the next number is how much time you spend in the stretch position in the bottom, okay? So, for example, if it was 0, then we'd be coming down to the bottom and straight back up, okay? Whereas if it was like a 2, we'd be taking a 2 count pause in that bottom position. And then the third number is the concentric portion. So this is when the muscle is shortening, okay? So it's decreasing in length, and that will be that movement, okay? So very simple. So that would be a 1 second concentric up to the top, and then if the last number was 0 again, that is the amount of time you're spending in the shortened position, so in that contracted position with a little pause, okay? So if it was 0, there'd be no pause and we'd be going back down, or if it was 2, it'd be 1, 2, and back down. So it goes eccentric, lengthened position, concentric, shortened position, okay? And refer back to those articles to have that explained a little bit better if you haven't seen them already. So that's what tempo is. And the problem with a lot of like explanations of tempo and like its uses, its applicability, etc., they tend to be a little bit shallow in terms of like people just go to research and they say, oh, let's look at the research on repetition tempo, and it's like, oh, it's not very strong, because like it's not something that you just compare between two random groups of lifters, because tempo is a highly individual thing, and it's not the numbers. The magic isn't in the numbers, the magic is in what those numbers stand for, okay? So for example, when we discuss some of the biomechanical concepts of chest training, we discussed that that in a bench press, for example, we would be weakest in the bottom position, okay? So we're weakest in the bottom position, meaning that the pec is in its least advantageous position to produce force, but our shoulder is also probably in the most injury vulnerable position, okay? So it's going to be most vulnerable to injury or insult or discomfort down in that position, just because of the position that it's in. Very similar to flies or any other exercise like that as well. So if we've got this position where we are weak and where there's sort of an increased risk of injury, then we need to be very controlled in and out of that position. And tempo is something that allows us to sort of standardize that. So it's not the fact that you're just spending 3 seconds on the eccentric. Like you could spend the 3 seconds like 1, 2, and then bounce for that last second. Would that be the exact same as me going 1, 2, 3 consistently? No, it wouldn't, which is why it's important to not look at tempo from such a superficial perspective rather. So tempo is a very useful tool to allow you to learn the control of the movement, particularly in the changes of direction, and that's where I see the most value of it. So if I give you 3 seconds, a 3-second eccentric on a bench press, for example, I'm expecting that there's going to be 1, 2, 3, and then we're changing our direction. Okay, so what a lot of people will do, and why they will kind of criticize tempo because they mightn't have experienced the benefits, is they'll just go 1, 2, 3, and then out. Okay, so they just bounce, and you see that a lot on the bench press, where people will control the start of the movement, and then they'll bounce down to their chest and use momentum to get out of the bottom position because that is where they're weakest. But we know that you're able to generate passive tension in that position, meaning that the tension or force produced and the initiation of the movement is coming not necessarily from active muscular contraction, but from some elastic energy generated by some of the ligaments, tendons, joint capsule, everything that's just in that position that isn't your muscle. Okay, so with that in mind, that's kind of our first point. Tempo is a very useful tool to teach you the skill of changing direction. And the next point that I wanted to make was in relation to like how that change of direction is actually impacting the forces that are experienced. So what we have to remember is that the force from a load that we are lifting is not always the same. So if I decelerate really, really slowly like this, it means that the force that I'm experiencing from the load is going to be fairly consistent throughout the range, and I'm not going to need to, there's not going to be a massive increase in force requirement to change direction versus if I was to decelerate really quickly. So if you decelerate really quickly on a lift and you just go vroom, it means firstly, you're resisting less load throughout this part of the range, and then when it comes to actually decelerating and changing direction at the bottom, there's a massive increase in the force that you need to actually output in order to change the direction of that weight. This is why you'll typically see people, when they use this technique, they're usually bouncing off something. So it might be their chest, or at the bottom of the squat it might be their knees. So because they actually need that additional force production from passive structures to allow them to move the weight, because you'll very rarely see people drop and then like stop it like off of their chest and then change direction. The forces there are absolutely huge, and that's why you'll see people use those things in order to help them. Because while it is useful obviously to just track your weights, you need to actually standardize that tempo, because it's a very different experience and a very different risk of injury in the situation where you control the weight and then change direction versus dropping and then trying to change direction. Because to take it a step further, and one of the reasons why I really like the use of tempo for beginners, and I think this is kind of backwards, because like you may have seen like some hierarchy of needs that says that tempo isn't really important, and the thing is, it's like, yeah, but you're looking at it from the perspective of the contribution to hypertrophy from research, whereas and it makes it look like that's an advanced tool, when in reality it's actually more of a beginner's tool to utilize slow tempos in order to teach someone the movement. Okay, so as we said, not only is it down to the force that, not only is it the force that you're experiencing that we need to consider, but also your ability to control the movement, a coordinated, advanced, complex movement like a bench press. Alright, so with the bench press, it's not a case of just moving up and down. Okay, you actually need to be able to coordinate holding the bar. Where are your elbows? You know, what angle is your shoulder at? Are you able to keep those scapula pinched back and down the whole time? Because for advanced lifters, they may not see the value in actually prescribing specific tempos, because they're so used to doing all of those things. Whereas when it comes to a beginner, it's very difficult for someone to just drop for 1 second and then keep all those things in place, not compensate somewhere else, and also keep intent on the muscle that they're trying to work. It's a completely different thing. And this is something I do in my own programming. When I program for myself, I'll generally start a program, if I have a new exercise in there, I'll always start that with a slower tempo, and then I'll progress to a slightly quicker one to a certain extent. Obviously I'm still controlling the movement, but I'll progress to that once I know that I have every inch locked in and I'm able to maintain stability throughout the exercise. Okay, so now we know that tempo has the potential to reduce your risk of injury since you're not going to be increasing forces where you're weakest a lot of the time. But we also know that it's going to help you to learn movements better, okay? And also it's going to allow you a better chance of overload throughout the range, okay? And this is an important point too, because if you just drop from there and you're taking all the load down here, then yeah, you're working hard down in that position, but you're not actually working the muscle through the rest of its range optimally, because you're not actually controlling the eccentric in those positions, okay? And this goes for a lot of exercises, and it was just something we wanted to quickly kind of brush over, because like I think the points that I've discussed here probably aren't mentioned all that often. I think people just want to talk about things like time under tension and constant tension and this kind of stuff, and it's like, yeah, that's all very well, but to me, like, discussing the concept of keeping tension on a muscle is a bit irrelevant. It's like yeah, we know that we want to keep tension on the muscle throughout a repetition. I don't think that using extremely slow tempos is necessarily any better directly from a hypertrophy perspective. Like, I don't think you need to do 6-second concentrics and eccentrics. I don't think that's going to enhance the hypertrophy process directly. But I do think this is something that needs to be periodized, and I think that for beginners, moving from a very slow, controlled tempo to maybe quicker ones as you actually learn a movement is useful. So for example, like, I will give clients 5-second eccentrics on some exercises along with a 1-second pause and a 2-second concentric, because that may be appropriate for them in that context. But does that mean that I think that's a good idea for me? Probably not, because I know I can control the load throughout the range. And this is one of the kind of arguments that gets thrown back. You know, people say that, like, especially in relation to concentrics, people will say that, oh no, you need to lift the weight as fast as possible to recruit the maximum amount of motor units, produce as much force as possible. And it's like, yeah, that's true, but you want to first be able to generate tension from the right area to actually move that weight. Because we know that, like, if I tell a beginner, if I tell some of you that are just lifting for maybe under a year to go and do a bench press as fast as you can, you're gonna get that weight up however you deem appropriate. You're just gonna be like, yeah, I'm gonna do it. It's like boom, boom, and the shoulder lifted up, and like you're off the bench, and your back is arched, and your hips are up, and all this different stuff, because all you're thinking about is A to B. And that's why I don't feel telling people to lift the weight as fast as possible is very helpful, especially for the majority of the people that are in here. You know, a lot of you aren't advanced lifters that have been lifting for more than like 3 to 5 years. So don't forget that, okay? Once you get to the point where you are fully competent in controlling every single inch of a movement, and you have progressed your loads a little bit, and you know that you're able to take weights like close to failure safely and that it's actually the muscle that is coming to failure, and it's not like your technical breakdown, then that's the point at which you start to lift maybe a bit more explosively. So like, if you're able to keep everything completely in control, then it may be appropriate to launch that weight up a little bit faster with a concentric that's as fast as you can move it with control. But it's a prerequisite. It's important for you to first get to the stage where you have the control, where you've practiced the slow tempos, where you've learned the movement, where you're able to keep tension on the muscle. So think holistically, guys. All right, I'm going to leave it there, but just don't always accept, you know, these answers to, oh, is X good for hypertrophy at face value based on a study or whatever. Because realistically, like, how are you going to study the things I just talked about? Like, most of the things I spoke about are completely subjective. And while you can go into a research lab and say, does a 3010 tempo result in greater hypertrophy than a 6010 tempo, it doesn't really tell you a lot, because by reading a research paper you can't necessarily tell, you know, how competent each lifter in that study was to control the movement. Were they all staying in their active range? Was the tempo consistent throughout the range, or did they decide to go 1, 2, 3 and then change direction? So keep these things in mind, guys, and I would encourage you, if you've never utilized the concept of tempo, to use it. All right, so start adding it into your program. I think for most people, like, something along the lines of a 3110 or 3111 or 3010 is a good place to be for the majority of the time. But when it comes to like beginners, if you're first learning a movement, I think a 3 1, 2, 1 is good. All right, so that 2-second concentric will really help you to engage the working muscle and to learn the normal pattern of movement, because like 2 seconds, it's not even that slow. Like it sounds slow, but like it's 1, 2, like that looks pretty normal. And I mean, it's going to really help you long term, and this is what it's all about. Think long term about your lifting, you know, progress to where you need to get to, but start with what you need right now. All right, so thanks very much for watching, guys, and leave any further questions you have down below.